right. Hey, it's so good to be with you. I'm so excited about this topic that you chose for your theme here, because this is one that we are wrestling with right now as a mission agency. As we sort of took stock of ourselves and looked at who we are and the age of the people that are ministering, we recognized that we had a decision to make. We could either close the doors when sort of my generation is done with this organization called Biblical Ministries Worldwide. We could close the mission agency, or we could somehow morph this organization into one that is going to be palatable and useful to the next generation that's going to come along. And so we're right now hip deep in this topic, wrestling with this very issue. For the last 2 years we've been wrestling with this, and we're not going to change our theology. And I realize that if we changed our theology, that would automatically widen the doors, and there would be people that would be attracted to joining us. And we're not interested in that, because we are convinced that the doctrinal position we have is what the Word of God teaches. So we're standing firm on that. That's characteristic of the IFCA, that there's a doctrinal position that we hold to, and we're committed to that. And so we're not talking tonight or even this week about the issue of changing theology or changing our doctrine. But there are some things that we are discovering as we are researching this and trying to understand the next generation of people coming along. We realize there are some things that we could change. And there are some things that we can do differently in our mission organization, so that when they put us out to pasture and are done with us, that this next generation is going to say, hey, you know, there's an organization that will be useful to us. And so we've opted in that direction. And we're right now in the process of making some adjustments so that this next generation, as they take a look at our organization, will say, yeah, we can serve with them. And we realize that it's going to stretch us, because some of us are going to have to think a little bit differently. We're going to have to understand this next generation a little bit better than what we think we do. And we're going to have to adjust maybe some of the ways that we do things. And so I am very interested in this topic, and I come to you not talking as an authority, but as a practitioner right in the middle of this issue right now, trying to figure this stuff out. So I'm hoping that we can learn from one another in the next couple of days that we're here. One of my concerns as we wrestle with this issue is the fact that as I travel around the States and I visit a lot of churches, there's a whole gap of that generation in churches that I visit. I'm talking primarily of the 20s and early 30s. And many churches will have 40s, 50s, and 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, 80 years old, maybe have some kids in the nursery. But there's sort of this gap there of the 20s and the 30s in our churches. And if you have a whole bunch of them, you are sort of the exception. And you need to rejoice for that. And we need to sit at your feet and learn what you're doing and figure out how you were able to attract and minister to that particular demographic. But obviously, if churches are going to miss that demographic, that age group, we call them millennials. If you miss those, our days are numbered as a mission organization, because we don't produce missionaries, you do. And so I have ulterior motives here by addressing this issue, because I realize that the future of missions and what we're doing is very much dependent upon whether or not you can pull this off. And as I've studied this and wrestled with it a lot over the last 18 months, 24 months or so, I've sort of come to the conclusion that our job is easier than yours. We can adapt and we can adjust to things a whole lot easier than maybe you can as a church. We can sort of spread out, and we've got the whole world to play with. But you got to try to get everybody in one room and happy with each other, and that's a bit of a challenge. How do you do that? But somehow we need to address this issue and wrestle with it. And so I was so excited to see what you've chosen as a theme for these couple of days that we're here. And I hope that I can at least stir the pot. I don't know if I can come up with all the answers for you as a church, but I hope that at least I can whet your appetite to be doing some serious studying on this topic. Because ultimately, if there is going to be faithful leaders for the next generation, we're going to have to do something very specifically with the 20 and 30-year-olds in our churches if our kinds of churches are going to continue on. And so that's what we want to talk about. This is incredibly important to us as a mission organization, and I would think it would be of vital importance and of interest to you as a church. And maybe some of you that have figured this out can help us a bit as we talk around the table and maybe have even some discussion times in the next couple of days. In order to understand how to deal with this, I think there's a pivotal concept that we need to wrestle with, and I want to talk about that tonight. My parents were missionaries in Nigeria. I grew up in Africa. I was a missionary in Africa as well before taking over the responsibility of this organization. My parents were those pioneering kind that went out into the bush. I mean, I was born here in the States, but at 3 months old, they had me as a baby out there just busting through the bush with a four-wheel drive, and they went out to these villages that they knew that were there and never had a missionary out there before. They had never seen a white person, and that's where I grew up. And so because I grew up in that kind of a situation, this is, a few years ago. It was before homeschooling, before correspondence courses and all the rest of that. And so we went to boarding school, and I realized that when I talk about boarding school today, people view that almost as child cruelty. And don't look badly at my parents. I hold no grudges towards them. I respect them for what they were willing to do. The generation that went to the mission field before my parents actually left their kids here in the States for 4 years at a time with grandparents or with other relatives. And so for us to be away at boarding school during the school year from September to December, and then we'd go home for Christmas, then we'd do a spring semester, and then be home for the summer. We were away from our parents for maybe 8-9 months out of the year. Well, that was just the way it was. That was the way we did missions back in those days. And I applaud my parents for being willing to make that sacrifice. And I don't think it warped me too badly. I don't have too many psychological hang-ups because of it. But I honor my parents for their willingness to sacrifice. Well, at that boarding school where I grew up and where I went to school from grade 1, 7 years old, right on up through high school, this boarding school, we had what they call a rest hour. We call them naps here, Sunday afternoon naps. Except this was Africa, and so it was incredibly hot, and people took naps in the afternoon. Well, us kids, of course, didn't need it. But we were convinced that we had this rest hour after lunch every day simply because the house parents needed to somehow control us. And so they put us to bed, and we hated it. And Sunday was the worst because that was a longer one. But then Sunday afternoon after that nap, we would go out on a hike. And it was the one time that we could go out of bounds. You can imagine several hundred kids in the African bush. You just don't want them running all over the place. And so we had boundaries, and there was a fence around this place, the school that we're in. But that was the one time we could go off out of bounds, and one of the house parents would take us on a hike. And this was one of the places that they would take us. It was to the swinging bridge. And there's a picture from, 30, 40 years ago. No, maybe 50 years ago. I remember that bridge as being a lot bigger than that. You know how that is when you're a kid? Well, we went there one day, and we'd get out there in the middle, and of course, this being a suspension bridge, you can make this thing bounce, and we'd have a great fun with it and all the rest of that. And after we'd played for a while, we're sitting on this side, on this bank over here in this rock right in the front, and we're sitting there and talking with one of the house parents that had taken us, and we got sort of very philosophical as kids and started trying to figure out how'd they build that bridge. And so Uncle John started explaining to us that somebody had to take a rope and climb down to the bottom, swim across the river. This is the bottom of that thing, and climb up the other side. And then they pulled over another cable and another cable until finally they had the bridge built. I use that as simply an illustration to sort of set our minds in a direction tonight. That basically we are all bridge builders. So that there are people that just sort of rapidly go across the bridge, don't have to spend too much attention to trying to get across the river because it becomes relatively easy. And basically our job is to create bridges so the generation that follows us can go further and faster. That ought to be our goal. I think that is what's encompassed in this verse of Scripture, and we're only going to take a look at this one verse tonight. We'll spread this out a little bit more in the next couple of days and tease this out. But there's this one principle that I think if we can embrace this one and understand this one, it will help us in this whole thing that we're talking about as we prepare for the next generation. John 14:12, Jesus said, "Truly I say unto you, whoever believes in me will also do greater works, or works that I do, and greater works," and it's actually in italics, the word works, "greater than these will he do." Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't really understand that verse. I have some ideas about what Jesus may have meant, But he was somehow making this statement that the people that would follow him would do something greater than him. And that just boggles my mind. This is Jesus. This is Creator God. But I think he's teaching us a principle here. And that is simply this, that we ought to expect that the next generation is going to do things better and bigger and faster and go further than we did if we do our job right. If we have built the bridges correctly, if we have paved the way for them, we ought to see the next generation doing bigger and better things than us. Well, in Jesus' life, perhaps he was referring to the idea that, he rarely traveled out of Palestine, but those 11 standing before him, they went all over the world. Perhaps he was referring to the book of Romans where Paul writes to the church and said, your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. And the testimony of that church had penetrated the whole planet, according to Romans chapter 15, or Romans chapter 1, verse 8. Paul traveled widely. The rest of these guys went out there. And when Jesus left, there were maybe a few hundred people that were gathered together on the first day of Pentecost, 3,000 people, and this thing just exploded in numbers after Jesus left. Perhaps those are some of the ideas that Jesus was putting across to those disciples that day. He was getting ready to go back to heaven. In fact, the top of this chapter, the beginning of it, is that very familiar passage of Scripture that says, let not your heart be troubled, Jesus is saying to his disciples. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, and I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare that place for you, I'm going to come and call you to myself. And it's within that context of saying, you know what, I'm going to step back. I'm leaving. I'm sort of retiring, or I'm moving on. They're putting me out to pasture. I'm speaking of myself here. What's going to happen when our generation is no longer leading the churches and organizations that we lead? Jesus was saying, you really ought to look forward with great expectation to that this next generation is going to take it further than you did. And I don't know how Jesus could possibly be saying this, because nobody can trump what Jesus did, but he was fully expecting that they would do bigger and better things than him. But we shouldn't really be too surprised by that, because we see this example throughout Scripture. Remember, Barnabas loomed large in that early church. And he took Paul under his wing. And he was the one that sort of introduced him to the church of Jerusalem because everybody's afraid of him. And he went up and got him and brought him down to the city of Antioch and sort of mentored him there. And they take off on that first missionary journey. And then Paul and Barnabas just sort of fades off the scene. And Paul does far bigger and better things than Barnabas ever did. Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt. But he had a protege. And it was Joshua that led them into the promised land. And Joshua did greater things than his mentor, Moses. The same thing happened with Elijah and Elisha, where Elijah got a double portion of God's Spirit. And while Elijah did 7 miracles, Elisha did 11. He outstripped Elijah. But yet we tend to think in terms of who Elijah was, but it was actually Elisha that did more. And so I think there is a basic principle here. There's a principle that when we properly do our job in our generation and we build the right bridges, the next generation is going to do far better than us. We ought to expect that, and we ought to be disappointed if that doesn't happen. We all know who Michelangelo is, but do you know who mentored him? There was a guy. Why? Well, we don't pay too much attention to the mentor. It's Michelangelo that gets all the credit. But that is the spirit in which we have to enter this topic that we're going to talk about for the next couple of days. That we don't really care about us. We need to care about this next generation. And our agenda is to build some bridges for them so that they will be able to do things that maybe we were not able to do. This is really the core of what mission work is all about. The thing that distinguishes us as missionaries is that we plan to leave. We go to the mission field, we plan to lead people to Christ and disciple them, start some churches, but we're going to step away. We're not going to stay and pastor that church. We want that to be on their own. And so this is sort of built into the psyche of a missionary. But it really needs to be built into the mindset of every believer that my role on planet Earth is to help the next generation to do better things and greater things than I have done. A good missionary realizes that he's dispensable. We need to remember that we all stand on someone else's shoulders. And the only reason we can do what we do today is because there were some people that went before us and they built some bridges that we just sort of zip across. I got an airplane in Atlanta and flew out here. Other than the fact that I had prepared to say this, I didn't really think too much about the Wright brothers. But it was because of the Wright brothers that we could get in a jet and we could do things that they never dreamed of doing. Well, maybe they dreamed of it, but they never did it. So the idea, do you get the principle here? Jesus is saying there's a way that we need to think, and that is simply this, that we need to be building bridges so that the next generation can take it further and faster and higher and further and better and everything else than our generation has. And that is the way that we need to approach this next generation. The poet has put it this way. An old man going on a lone highway came at evening, cold and gray, to a chasm, vast and deep and wide, through which was flowing a sullen tide. The old man crossed in twilight dim. The sullen stream had no fears for him. But he turned when safe on the other side and built a bridge to span the tide. Old man, said a fellow pilgrim near, you're wasting your strength with building here. Your journey will end with the ending day. You will never again pass this way. You've crossed the chasm deep and wide. Why build you a bridge at eventide? The builder lifted his old gray head. Good friend, in pain I have come, he said. There followeth me after me today a youth whose feet must pass this way. This chasm that has been not for me to that fair-haired youth may a pitfall be. He too must cross in twilight dim. Good friend, I'm building that bridge for him. And so that's really the idea that I want us to come across with throughout the next couple of days. That we are to be building bridges for this next generation with the full expectation that they're going to do far better than we have done. And that ought to be success for us. We ought to rejoice in that. We're not building an empire so that we can pat ourselves on the back. We are helping other people to build and for them to do better than we did. Some people take a look at this next generation that's following. We call them millennials. They're people that were born between 1980 and 2000. There's a few of you here in this room here tonight. Some of you, and I know we don't like labels, and we don't like to be sort of bundled together with other people because we're distinct individuals. But in generality, there's some, we call this next group millennials. My generation was called the baby boomers. And there are certain characteristics about our generation that is quite different from this next generation of millennials. A couple, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had at our office in Atlanta a bunch of missions professors in missions of missions in Bible colleges, and they convened at our office, and we're talking a lot of stuff about missions, and it was just sort of a time for them to cross-pollinate and to spend time with each other, and I was so encouraged to hear them talk. This generation, they say, these guys that are working with these millennials, training them right now, they believe that they have the potential of being the greatest missionaries that the United States has ever produced. And it was so encouraging to hear that potential and to hear that enthusiasm by these missions profs. I read the other day, every ministry is an interim ministry. You say, well, I plan on spending 30 years here. Yeah, but you're interim. After 30 years, you're going to be gone. You see, all of us are interim. All of us are temporary. We're all just passing through. And even if you stay for at the same place for 50 years, you're not going to be able to outlast this thing unless the rapture happens before you're finished. So all of us are in interim ministries, and our idea is, and our heartthrob ought to be, how do we prepare this next generation to build this thing bigger and better than we have ever? And I think there needs to be a spirit of optimism and enthusiasm for this next generation. In our organization, we're working through this right now, and it's not going to be easy. We recognize that some of the problems are not just our systems and the way we do things, but we recognize that our mission family on the field is really not ready for this next generation. In fact, just in this past year, in 2014, I can think of 3 or 4 instances where this very issue of the next generation trying to join the existing generation has caused problems for us within our mission family. And it's just related to the fact that here are 2 different generations that are talking different languages with different values, with different ways of approaching things. And one is not right and the other wrong. It's just different. And somehow we're going to have to understand one another, and we're engaged in this process of trying to figure out who in our mission family is going to be able to work with this next generation and be able to adjust to them and work with them successfully, or are we going to have this? And you're going to have to struggle with that in your church as well. And there's practical issues that I don't have the answers for, and I'm not even here to suggest what they ought to be. All I know is that somehow if we're going to build into the next generation those that are going to be the leaders in our church, we're going to have to somehow connect with them, and somehow they're going to have to be a part of our lives, and we're going to have to be doing something for that to happen. And so we're struggling through this right now. I hope that you as a church are also struggling with this, and that this is a point of conversation. There is a ton of stuff out there written about millennials. So you don't have to search very far to find this. All the information is there. If you need some books, maybe I can recommend some to you later. But let's talk a little bit about them just to sort of introduce this topic tonight. And I'm not going to go long because I know everybody's traveled and you're a little bit tired, but we're going to sort of cut this one a little bit short here tonight. Someone made this statement. The children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders. They love chatter in the place of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents. They chatter before company, gobble up dainties at the table. They cross their legs and they tyrannize their teachers. You know who said that? We've always complained about the next generation. Every generation has had a problem with the next generation coming along. So if you have a problem with millennials, welcome to the club. Socrates beat you to it. And every generation has sort of looked at the next one and said, boy, we don't know if we can figure these guys out. Then that generation grows up, and my son has always considered himself young, and he started a business, and he's hiring. And now he's 40 years old now. But he's always thought of himself as young and hip and everything else. And it's so funny to hear him complaining about these young people that he's employing in his company. Every generation has a problem with the next one. In fact, the generation right before the next one is the one that's the hardest on the next one. And they see some of their own bad in that next generation. So we need to realize from the very outset that this is just an ongoing, there's nothing new, that we're going to struggle a little bit trying to understand the next generation, but I don't think that excuses us from not trying. And if we are going to work with the next generation, whom we have a responsibility for, we're going to have to understand them a little bit better than perhaps we do presently. We're going to have to do some research and some study and some understanding of them. And perhaps you have some millennials in your family, and so you're seeing them and you're wondering, where did these guys come from? I raised them in a good Christian home, and how'd they turn out to be like that? But they were raised in a totally different world than you and I, who have gray or bald heads, were raised in. And they're thinking differently. And there are those people out, within a stone's throw of your church building that maybe you're not connecting with. But if there's going to be a future for your church, somehow you're going to have to connect with them. And it is not all doom and gloom. We don't have to be negative like Socrates. I think we can be upbeat about this. We can be positive about it. I think there's incredible potential, and I love the idea that the greatest generation of missionaries from North America may still be in the future. And we ought to be rejoicing in that concept and with that idea and with that thought. I don't want to spend time this evening being negative on the millennials. Instead, I want to show you some of the positive traits. And I'm pulling this through the grid of a director of a mission organization looking at missionaries for the future. But I think you'll see some application here for your church because we're all basically in the same business. But there are some things that are characteristic of this next generation that are incredibly positive that I think will make them incredible missionaries in the future. Let me go through this list just briefly, and then we're going to wrap it up. For some of us, the word tolerant is a negative term. And I realize that tolerance of sin, tolerance of certain things are not good. So it can have a negative connotation. But but there is some positive side to this. That there sometimes has to be, especially in the world of missions, a little bit more tolerance. One of the problems that we have in missions is that our generation, we might as well admit it, we're quite racist. Do you realize the millennials are colorblind? 38% of the millennials are not white. And they are growing up in a culture here in North America that is very mixed, and they're colorblind, and that's why they're mixing, and they're getting married between all these different races, and for them that's a non-issue. They don't even see color. Now that excites me in the mission world, because one of the problems that we have in missions is someone goes to the mission field and there's sort of this air of superiority that we have as Americans, and we think we're better than somebody else because our skin is white or because we're American. You may see this as negative, but they, for instance, were not raised thinking about American exceptionalism. And for us, patriotism and American exceptionalism is at the core of our being. And we're sort of very political in our generation. This next generation has gotten so cynical, they've been turned off by that. And one of the great things in the world of missions is, at least when they go to the rest of the world, they're not going to be trying to fly the American flag. They're going to respect people for who they are. And so for me, when I see that kind of tolerance towards people that are different from them, that is a positive thing. And come on, let's be honest. Isn't some of the struggle that you have in your churches and reaching some of the other nationalities that have moved into your neighborhood simply because we don't have that tolerance? And these people don't eat like us, they don't dress like us, they don't talk like us, they don't smell like us, they do things. And so we would not be so brazen as to say we're racist, but we just aren't going to really fellowship with them. And they're welcome to our church as long as they just show up on Sunday and then leave us alone the rest of the week. And I know I'm being kind of hard on us, but let's be honest, in our generation, isn't there some element of that? Whereas the next generation is going to say, you know what, that's a non-issue to us. And God is raising up another generation of people who were raised in a different environment than the one that most of us were raised in. Because of that, they're colorblind, and they're going to make great missionaries because of that. And there's going to be a respect for these other nationalities, and when they get off the plane, they will have left their American flag back at home, and they will see that person as an equal. And that's the makings of a good missionary. This next generation is going to be far more community-oriented than our generation is. They tend to operate in team far better than we do. They have a much higher priority of family than perhaps our generation did. They tend to form these strong tribal groups. They've got friends and groups of friends and because of social networking and everything else, they have built this identity of team that quite frankly, our generation hasn't done so good. We have as a core value relationships in our organization, and we struggle with that. And our preference is to work in teams on the mission field. There's a good precedent for that in the book of Acts with the Apostle Paul and all his missionary journeys. He always operated within the context of a team. And we struggle with that. We really work hard at that. And to be quite honest, we fail as much as we succeed in that whole issue of team because our generation doesn't do so well with that. This generation is so community-oriented. I believe that they're going to do far better in teamwork than our generation ever thought of doing. And in that team, there's going to be a strength and a dynamic that we could have never reproduced by simply going out there and trying to work on our own. This generation loves those relationships probably far better than we do. The exciting thing about this next generation is the fact that they desire the older generation involved in their lives. The oldest guy in our office, Jim Brown, is, I think, 77 years old. He has about 30 or 40 college-age kids that he meets with. He spends more time in Starbucks than he does in our office. These guys just love to be with him. The oldest guy in the office. because they respect and they honor age, perhaps like our generation did not. And they want that coaching and mentoring from our generation. And your gray hair or your bald head is a plus if you can change your mind and wrap your mind around this idea of connecting with this next generation. Some can, some can't, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow, and what sort of the distinguishing marks are between those who can mentor this next generation and those of you who choose not to. And so we need to realize that as we think in terms of this next generation, they're going to be far more relational oriented than maybe the previous generations were. There are obviously some negative sides to any of these, and I'm not going to dwell on any of those here today. I just want to point out some of the strengths so that you can see the potential of what could happen in your church if you would unleash the potential of the people that are in your neighborhood and that could be a part of your church if you would first of all understand with them, start relating to them and start coaching and mentoring them and cut them loose. Great things could happen. This next generation is desiring education far more than the previous generation. In fact, the majority of college students now are thinking in terms of a postgraduate degree. And that's one of the things that sort of delayed their maturity. They say, I don't have to grow up because I'm going to be in school for the next 8 years. And so they're thinking in terms of not just getting a bachelor's degree, but moving on. And so I guess it's great news for seminaries and post-grad programs because this next generation is going to keep right on moving in the educational process. This next generation is going to go to the mission field and be involved in ministry with a far greater understanding of the world around them than we were. One of the most profound statements that I've heard in recent years is this. This is the first generation that has not had to depend on authority figures to give them information. Now think of the ramifications of that. This is the first generation that has not had to depend on authority figures to give them information. In other words, in the past, you always either went to the professor at the college or the university, or you went to the priest, or you went to the politician. They were the brokers of knowledge. They're the one that had all the knowledge, and if you wanted it, you had to go to them. You had to go to their libraries. You had to go to them because they were the authority. They were the ones that were in the know. And the internet has totally changed that so that this generation doesn't have to go to the power brokers of this world to get information. And that changes the whole dynamic of this thing. And I talk to guys that teach in colleges, and some of them can deal with it, some can't, to have the kids sitting there Googling everything they say and checking them out. And a missionary arrives on the field, and in our generation, you sort of got off the plane and you saluted to the field leader and said, what do I do next? This next generation gets off the plane, and they view that field leader, even though he's been there for 30 years, as a peer, and they have probably come better educated because they have researched this with hundreds of different people in hundreds of different places, and they no longer are just going to bow to the field leader that's there, and that field leader feels like this person, he's insubordinate. What are you going to do when right in the middle of your sermon somebody's checking out what you're saying? Can you handle that? You see, these are some of the changes. Is it right or wrong? I'm not here to say one's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's different. Can we handle the next generation coming along? We're going to have to think a little bit differently because this is a generation that's thinking in education differently. They're going to learn more on their iPhone than probably what they're going to learn in the classroom. And they may learn more theology on that iPhone than what they get from your message. It's going to hurt our feelings as preachers. But we need to either revel in that and leverage it, or we can fight it and get discouraged by it. But may I come back to the illustration that I started with? We are here to build bridges. Why? Because we want this next generation to go further and faster than our generation ever went. This generation, it's estimated, will be far more productive. Now, those of you that know the typical portrait of a millennial will say, I don't see that one. They're at 27 years old, they're still in their mother's basement playing video games. But the next one down, or a couple ones down, cause-driven, when they get a cause and they match that up with team, it is a powerful combination. And when young people catch a vision, if with proper coaching, will go further and faster with the energy and the enthusiasm that we have. I'm excited about the potential of what they're going to do. And so what that means is they will come and listen to your sermons, but you better have some way to put that into action. You may want to take up an offering for missions, but you also better give them a way for them to do something and get their hands dirty. I blog, and if you want to check it out, it's paulseger.com, and I just write about mission stuff. If you're interested in mission stuff, it's there. Thanks to Jeff for setting me up on that. And I'm still doing this, 3, 4, 5 years later. And the one I just posted yesterday was, I was just sort of musing. Is there a future for the, what do we call it, the Faith Promise Program? Some of you probably use that for missions in your churches. So I'm just musing. I'm not saying there isn't. I'm just saying there. And one of the things that makes me wonder about the future of the Faith Promise Program is our generation was willing to just write the checks and send the money off. Not this generation. They will write the check. Well, they won't write a check because they don't have checks. Which, by the way, you better have a way for them to give electronically, because you're passing up a lot of offerings if you don't have some way in your lobby or some way on your internet to receive offerings from they don't carry cash, they don't have a checkbook, they've got a card, that's it. Or better yet, they're going to have an iPhone. You got to be able to figure out a way to receive money from people that only have iPhones. So this next generation, we're going to have to figure out, how do we relate to them in these kinds of issues? And it's not going to be enough for them just to put money in the offering plate and said, I've done my thing for missions. You're going to have to figure out, how do they get their hands dirty and do something in addition to that giving? They will give, but they've got to have a way that they're going to practically do something. And because they are enthusiastic and energetic, I see incredible potential that this next generation is going to provide for the missions endeavor. One bit of research that I read says that 88% of millennials rated the opportunity to have impact on the world as an important consideration in choosing an employer. They would rather earn half the salary but work for an employer that's going to do something, that's going to accomplish some cause, and everyone has their own pet cause. But they're saying, I want to do something to change the world, and they would rather do that and take a paycheck, a cut and pay. Our generation was trying to climb the ladder to say, how much money can I earn? They're saying, no, there's some other things that are more important on planet Earth. And when I start thinking in terms of people that think that way, I'm thinking, wow, these are missionaries. They are driven by a cause that the salary is not the important issue. We're going to change the world, and it's not how much I get paid. Isn't that so refreshing to hear that? And so I see great potential of this generation that is willing to set aside maybe some of, and yeah, they do, as long as they can afford that iPhone or that Mac, they're going to be happy, but they are going to want that stuff, but they're not going to be so concerned about the six figures. This next generation values authenticity. There's probably not been a generation that has been more cynical than this guy's. I mean, they are street savvy. You can't really push much over on them. I was reading just this week a interview that someone was giving of a millennial. The interviewer said this: you say that the way to stop the exodus of millennials from churches isn't cosmetic, in other words, better music, sleeker logos, more relevant program. Why are those methods ineffective in your mind? And here's what the millennial said. They aren't inherently bad strategies, and some churches would be wise to employ them, but many church leaders make the mistake of thinking millennials are shallow consumers who are leaving the church because they aren't being entertained. I think our reasons for leaving church are more complicated, more related to social changes and deep questions of faith than worship style or image. If you try to woo us back with skinny jeans and coffee shops, it may actually backfire. Millennials have a fine-tuned meter that can detect whether someone's just trying to sell us something. We're not looking for a hipper Christianity, we're looking for a truer Christianity. Every generation before and after, we're looking for Jesus, the same Jesus who can be found in the places he's always been. In baptism, in the Word, in suffering, in community, and among the least of these, no fog machines are required. Are you glad to hear that? You don't have to put a fog machine in your church in order to attract millennials. They're looking for authenticity. In fact, the trend right now is oftentimes away from the big box churches and those mega churches that tend to intimidate us because we can never get that many people in a room. You need to realize that you have a leg up on this thing because they are looking more for authentic communities of believers than they are the big show. So the potential is huge in your church if you'll simply leverage the potential, and you will have the mindset to deal with this next generation. They tend to be cause-driven, and they tend to be holistic. And what we mean by that is simply this, that they are very concerned about social justice and compassion, and that has to be drawn through the Word of God so that there's a biblical foundation and a theology of that, something that maybe our generation didn't have to think through that well, but you better think through that. And if you haven't spent some time studying social justice and compassion ministries through the Word of God and established that for your church, you better do that. Because those are the things that are triggering their thinking. That's their interest points. And there's a lot of stuff that is simply going to repeat the social gospel problems that we had in the previous generation. But there is a place for social justice and compassion ministries within the Church of Jesus Christ, but you better figure out where that fits into the whole scheme of things in your church, and you better start talking about those kinds of things. And I'm talking to millennials, and I'm hearing more and more of them saying, we love our church, but our church is not doing anything by way of helping the needy and the poor in the world. So I don't know what the answer is for you. All I know is this is what a millennial tends to look like, and these are the positive traits about them, and we can leverage them. If we will start building some bridges, we can perhaps help this next generation to go further and faster. And so I'm going to pick this up again tomorrow morning. We're going to keep talking about this and figure out maybe some things that we can practically do and how we can accelerate this process. But we have to, first of all, in our generation, make the decision whether we want to. And so the encouragement tonight as you put your head on the pillow is to first of all figure out whether you really want to. And I'm going to press that point a little bit tomorrow, so if you don't want to decide tonight, wait and see what I have to say tomorrow morning. And maybe before you make that final decision, you might want to hear the rest of the story. But I, for one, am going on record that I want to. Because I believe in the words of Jesus that the next generation can outstrip our generation. And that the best days of missions can still be ahead of us if some of us are willing to work with this next generation. The same thing can be true of your church. The best days of your church could be ahead of you, but you're going to have to be willing to work with this next generation for that to happen. Father, I pray that you would indeed help us to sift through all of the tensions and the problems and the challenges of this topic. Help us to figure out what we could or should do. Father, we don't want to waver on what we believe and what we teach. But if it's not in your word, Lord, our heart's desire is how can we help this next generation to get across the gorge? And we want to be bridge builders. So we commit ourselves to that end. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.